Charles Manson, the cult leader who orchestrated the gruesome Tate LaBianca murders in 1969, was famously portrayed in the television movie Helter Skelter. Though he didn't physically commit the murders, his psychological control over his followers led to his conviction for first-degree murder and conspiracy. He spent over 40 years in prison, becoming a lasting symbol of evil in American culture. Manson died on November 19, 2017, at 83, from cardiac arrest and complications of colon cancer while serving his life sentence. His death initiated a 4-month legal battle for control of his remains. A court ultimately awarded his body to his grandson, Jason Freeman. On March 20, 2018, Manson was cremated following a small, private funeral service. His ashes were then scattered along a creek bed in an undisclosed forest location in California. This secrecy was intentional, designed to prevent the site from ever becoming a shrine for his followers or a place of morbid curiosity. As a result, there is no public grave or final marker for Charles Manson, ensuring his physical presence was erased from the landscape. Bonnie Parker became an American folk legend as one half of the criminal couple Bonnie and Clyde. Immortalized in the classic 1967 film of the same name. A small-town Texas girl with a flair for poetry, she joined Clyde Barrow for a 2-year crime spree of robbery and murder across the South. Her poems, particularly The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, helped craft their romantic outlaw image, even as they were being hunted as dangerous fugitives. Her life ended violently on May 23, 1934. A posse of lawmen ambushed Bonnie and Clyde in their car on a rural road near Gibbsland, Louisiana, firing over 100 rounds and killing them instantly. Bonnie was 23. In her poetry, she had expressed a wish to be buried beside Clyde, but her family refused, wanting to bring her home and separate her from the man who led her to her death. Thousands attended her funeral in Dallas. Today, Bonnie Parker is interred at Crown Hill Memorial Park in Dallas. Her simple grave marker bears an epitaph from her mother. As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you. Clyde Barrow, the notorious leader of the Barrow Gang, was portrayed alongside Bonnie Parker in the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde. A product of poverty, Clyde was hardened by a brutal stint in the Texas prison system, which turned him from a petty thief into a ruthless killer. Known for his skill behind the wheel and his preference for the powerful Browning automatic rifle, he led his gang on a trail of robberies and shootouts that captivated a Depression-era America. Clyde's violent run ended with Bonnie's on May 23, 1934, in the Louisiana ambush. He was killed instantly by the posse's initial volley of gunfire. He was 25 years old. Like Bonnie, his funeral in Dallas drew a massive crowd of curious spectators. He was buried in Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas, placed next to his brother, Marvin Buck Barrow. His final wish to be buried with Bonnie was denied by her family, separating the infamous pair in death. A large granite headstone marks the graves of the two brothers, bearing an epitaph that Clyde had reportedly chosen for himself. Gone but not forgotten. Their separate grave sites continue to draw visitors, a testament to their enduring and notorious legend. John Dillinger, dubbed Public Enemy Number 1, was a charismatic bank robber whose criminal exploits were depicted in films like 1973's Dillinger. During the Great Depression, his daring prison escapes and numerous bank heists made him a folk hero to some, who saw him as striking back against the institutions that had failed them. For the FBI, he was the primary target in a nationwide manhunt that defined the era of the Public Enemy. Dillinger's criminal career ended on July 22, 1934, outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. He was betrayed by an acquaintance, Anna Sage, known as the Woman in Red, who tipped off federal agents. As Dillinger left the theater, agents led by Melvin Purvis moved in to arrest him. He allegedly attempted to draw a weapon, and the agents shot him dead in an alley. He was 31. After his body was publicly displayed, he was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in his hometown of Indianapolis. For decades, his grave was a target for souvenir hunters who chipped away pieces of his headstone. After several replacements, his grave is now marked with a simple, flat granite stone, reinforced with concrete to deter the persistent vandalism that has followed him even in death. Alphonse Al Capone was the formidable mob boss of the Chicago outfit during the Prohibition era. his brutal reign depicted in films like 1987's The Untouchables. He built a criminal empire on bootlegging and violence, most infamously orchestrating the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While he cultivated a flamboyant public persona, his downfall came not from his violent crimes, but from a conviction for tax evasion in 1931 that sent him to Alcatraz. After his release from prison, Capone's health was destroyed by advanced neurosyphilis. He retired to his Florida estate, where he spent his final years in mental decline. On January 25, 1947, he died of cardiac arrest following a stroke at the age of 48. After a private funeral in Chicago, Capone was first buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery. However, persistent grave robbing and vandalism prompted his family to move his remains in 1950. Today, Al Capone is interred in a family plot at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. A large granite monument, simply inscribed with the family name Capone, marks the final quiet resting place of the man who once ruled Chicago's underworld. Charles Lucky Luciano, a key figure in films like The Cotton Club, is considered the father of modern organized crime in America. A ruthless visionary, he established the Commission, governing body for the mafia that replaced bloody turf wars with a corporate structure. He earned his nickname Lucky after surviving a brutal attack by a rival gang. His rise to power was built on a foundation of betrayal and violence, forever changing the landscape of the American underworld. Convicted on prostitution charges in 1936, Luciano's sentence was commuted after World War II in exchange for his assistance to U.S. naval intelligence. He was then deported to his native Italy, never to return to America alive. He spent the rest of his life in exile. On January 26, 1962, Luciano was at the Naples International Airport to discuss a film about his life when he suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 64. Despite his deportation, his body was allowed to return to the United States for burial. After a large funeral, he was entombed in his family's mausoleum at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, bringing the exiled architect of the American Mafia back to New York for his final rest. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was a charismatic and famously violent mobster whose dream was to build a gambling paradise in the desert, a story told in the 1991 film Bugsy. An associate of Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, Siegel was a key figure in the national crime syndicate. He moved to California to develop rackets and mingle with Hollywood royalty. His grandest project was the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, an opulent resort funded by mob money. However, the project was plagued by massive cost overruns, fueling suspicion among his mob investors that he was skimming from them. This suspicion proved fatal. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was at his girlfriend Virginia Hill's home in Beverly Hills. An unknown assassin fired a rifle through the window, shooting him multiple times in the head and killing him instantly. He was 41. His murder, widely believed to be a syndicate hit, remains officially unsolved. Siegel was interred in the Beth Olam Mausoleum at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Hollywood, California. His final resting place is a simple marble crypt, an understated end for the flamboyant gangster whose vision helped create modern Las Vegas and whose violent death became a legendary Hollywood crime story. Lester Gillis, better known as Babyface Nelson, was a notoriously violent bank robber whose story was told in the 1957 film of the same name. Despite his boyish looks, Nelson was a volatile and ruthless killer, known for his explosive temper. An associate of John Dillinger, he was briefly named Public Enemy No. 1 after Dillinger's death. His criminal career was short but exceptionally bloody, marked by chaotic robberies and deadly confrontations with law enforcement. Nelson's life ended on November 27, 1934, in a ferocious shootout with FBI agents known as the Battle of Barrington. After a car chase, Nelson engaged two agents in a roadside gunfight. Though he was hit 17 times, he managed to fatally wound both agents before escaping. He died from his injuries later that evening at the age of 25. His body was found the next day, wrapped in a blanket in a ditch near a cemetery. Babyface Nelson is buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois. His grave is marked by a simple flat stone bearing his birth name, Lester J. Gillis, a quiet final resting place for one of the most savage figures of the Public Enemy era. Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd, whose story was featured in the FBI story, was an Oklahoma bank robber who became a folk hero in the Midwest. Though he was a hardened criminal implicated in multiple murders, including the Kansas City Massacre, he gained a Robin Hood-like reputation, with popular legends claiming he destroyed mortgage papers during his robberies. After the death of John Dillinger, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named Floyd Public Enemy Number 1, focusing the full power of the Bureau on his capture. The manhunt ended on October 22, 1934, when federal agents led by Melvin Purvis cornered Floyd on a farm near East Liverpool, Ohio. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed. The FBI maintained that he was killed while resisting arrest, but some local accounts claimed he was already wounded and possibly attempting to surrender when he was fatally shot. He was 30 years old. His body was returned to Oklahoma, where his funeral drew one of the largest crowds in the state's history, with tens of thousands in attendance. He was buried in Atkins Cemetery in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. His modest headstone marks the grave of a man who was both a feared outlaw and a celebrated legend. George "Machine Gun" Kelly Barnes, whose criminal career was noted in films like The Story of G.I. Joe, was a Prohibition-era gangster whose fearsome reputation was largely crafted by his wife, Catherine. She bought him his namesake Thompson submachine gun and cultivated his public image. His most famous crime was the 1933 kidnapping of an Oklahoma oil tycoon, which brought him to the attention of the FBI and led to his downfall. Kelly was captured in Memphis, Tennessee, in September 1933. According to FBI legend, he surrendered by shouting, "Don't shoot, G-men," which helped popularize the term for federal agents. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Alcatraz, where he was reportedly a model prisoner who earned the nickname Pop Gun Kelly from fellow inmates. He was later transferred to Leavenworth Penitentiary. On July 18, 1954, his 59th birthday, George Barnes died of a heart attack in his cell. He was buried in Cottondale Cemetery in Wise County, Texas, on his wife's family plot. A small, simple headstone bearing his birth name, George B. Kelly, marks the humble end for a gangster whose legend was larger than his life. Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, was a brutal New York City mob boss whose story was part of the backdrop for the Cotton Club. He built his empire on bootlegging and the Harlem Numbers racket and was known for his violent temper and miserly ways. His increasingly erratic behavior, particularly his plan to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, made him a liability to the Organized Crime Commission. Fearing the massive law enforcement crackdown that would follow, the commission sanctioned a hit on Schultz instead. On October 23, 1935, Assassins from Murder, Inc. stormed Schultz's headquarters at a Newark restaurant and opened fire. Schultz was shot but did not die immediately. He lingered for nearly a day, and his delirious stream-of-consciousness deathbed ramblings were famously transcribed by a police stenographer. He finally died from his injuries on October 24, 1935, at the age of 33. After a Jewish funeral service, Dutch Schultz was buried in Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. His grave is marked with a simple headstone bearing his birth name, Arthur Flegenheimer, a quiet end for a famously volatile gangster. Frank the Enforcer Nitti was a top figure in the Chicago outfit, serving as Al Capone's trusted lieutenant and later as the syndicate's operational boss after Capone was imprisoned. His portrayal in The Untouchables was highly fictionalized. In reality, Nitti was more of a shrewd manager than a hands-on killer. He successfully guided the outfit's transition from bootlegging into more stable rackets like gambling and labor union extortion. Nitti's downfall came in the early 1940s when he and other mob leaders were indicted for extorting Hollywood movie studios. Severely claustrophobic and facing a long prison sentence, Nitti became increasingly desperate. On March 19, 1943, the day before he was due to appear before a grand jury, he took a walk to a local rail yard in North Riverside, Illinois. There, he put a revolver to his head and ended his own life. He was 57 years old. Frank Nitti is buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, the very same cemetery where Al Capone rests. Though they share a final resting place, their plots are in different sections, a final separation for two of Chicago's most powerful mobsters. John Wilkes Booth was a famous stage actor and ardent Confederate sympathizer who committed one of the most infamous acts in American history, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, an event explored in films like The Lincoln Conspiracy. His plan, born of fanatical devotion to the Southern cause, shifted from kidnapping to murder after the Confederacy's surrender. On April 14, 1865, Booth shot President Lincoln at Ford's Theater and escaped, triggering a massive 12-day manhunt. On April 26th, federal troops cornered him in a tobacco barn in Virginia. When Booth refused to surrender, the troops set the barn on fire. He was then shot in the neck by a soldier and died a few hours later. His body was initially buried in secret and moved several times before being released to his family in 1869. He is interred in the Booth family plot in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. To prevent his grave from becoming a site of veneration or vandalism, his final resting place is deliberately left unmarked, a final anonymous end for the man who murdered a president. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man officially named the assassin of President John F. Kennedy, is a deeply controversial figure whose life was examined in the film JFK. A former Marine who once defected to the Soviet Union, Oswald was arrested on November 22, 1963, for allegedly firing the shots that killed the president in Dallas, Texas. Oswald never stood trial. 2 days later, on November 24th, while being transferred from police headquarters, he was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Oswald died at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy was pronounced dead. His burial was a bleak affair. Cemeteries refused his body, and a minister was difficult to find. He was finally interred in Shannon Rose Hill Memorial Park in Fort Worth, Texas. As no one would serve as pallbearers, news reporters covering the event were asked to help carry his casket to the grave. His original headstone was stolen years ago. Today, a simple ground-level marker that reads only Oswald marks the grave of one of history's most scrutinized figures. Grigory Rasputin was a Russian mystic whose immense influence over the family of Tsar Nicholas II was depicted in films like Rasputin and the Empress. His apparent ability to heal the hemophiliac heir, Alexei, earned him the Tsarina's undying loyalty, but his debauched lifestyle and political meddling made him a hated figure in Russia, seen as a dark force destroying the monarchy. His murder on December 30th, 1916, is legendary for its difficulty. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, allegedly poisoned him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine, with no effect. They then shot him, left him for dead, but he revived and attacked them. After shooting him several more times, they bound his body and threw it into the icy Neva River. An autopsy later suggested he was still alive when he entered the water. He was briefly buried, but after the revolution in 1917, soldiers exhumed his body, fearing his grave would become a shrine. They took his corpse to a forest and burned it to ash. There is no grave for Rasputin. His remains were scattered, a final violent dispersal for a man who unsettled an empire. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany and primary architect of World War II and the Holocaust, stands as one of history's most monstrous figures. His final days were powerfully depicted in the 2004 film Downfall. As dictator of Germany, he was responsible for a global war and the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others. As Soviet forces closed in on his Berlin bunker in the final days of the war, Hitler resolved to avoid capture. On April 30th, 1945, he and his new wife, Eva Braun, died by suicide in his private study. He shot himself while she ingested cyanide. Per his instructions, their bodies were carried outside to the Chancellery Garden, doused in gasoline and set ablaze. Soviet soldiers later found the charred remains. For decades, the KGB secretly held these remains, burying and exhuming them multiple times. Finally, in 1970, to prevent any future grave from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine, the last remnants were completely incinerated, and the ashes were scattered into a tributary of the Elbe River. No grave for Adolf Hitler exists. Benito Mussolini, known as Il Duce, was the founder of fascism and the dictator of Italy from 1922 until his downfall. His story was chronicled in productions like the 1983 miniseries The Winds of War. He dismantled democracy, forged an alliance with Nazi Germany, and led his country into a disastrous war. After Italy's collapse, Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans in April 1945 while trying to flee to Switzerland. On April 28th, he and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed by a firing squad. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down from a girder at a gas station, where they were desecrated by an enraged crowd. Initially buried in an unmarked grave, his body was later stolen by fascists before being recovered. After being held in state custody for more than a decade, his remains were returned to his family in 1957. Today, Benito Mussolini is interred in a stone sarcophagus in his family crypt in his hometown of Predappio. The site remains controversial, having become a place of pilgrimage for modern-day neo-fascists,